So, Larry, the big issue everyone's discussing is, can the Fed bring about what is called a soft landing? I guess that's to say avoid a recession. As you know, Bloomberg did a survey of 72 economists that show that economists are getting more and more skeptical. It's up to 27.5% in April. Before, it was 20%. If you go 2 months back, it was 15%.
Look, I think the risks are going way up. 27.5% this year, because next year is riskier than this year, translates to something getting towards 2/3 for a 2-year period, and I'd be a bit above that in my judgment. Here's the key fact. We have never had a moment in the United States when inflation was above 4 and unemployment was below 4, when we didn't have a recession 2 years within the next 2 years. So we may pull it off, and certainly it's hugely important that we succeed in pulling it off, but the combination of overheating followed by policy delay followed by supply shocks means I think it's a very difficult set of challenges, and recession in the next couple of years is clearly more likely than not. Some of the banks are starting to move in that direction. Your survey moved in that direction, and I suspect that's how the consensus will evolve.
And Larry, I feel like we're caught a little bit between the rock and the hard place. That is, between inflation on the one hand and recession on the other. And we worry particularly about how the people who are less fortunate are affected. You have a research paper from the National Bureau of Economic Research this week talking about what happens with wage growth. You would like to think that when wages grow, that helps everybody. Not necessarily so.
Here's the fact, David. If you just look at nominal wage growth, just measured wage growth, and growth in workers' purchasing power, up to a point, perhaps 4%, 4.5%, they move together. But past that point, because when inflation's running above 4%, you start to have inflation, serious inflation, things move in the opposite direction, and higher wage growth seems to go with lower growth in workers' purchasing power. That's why I was so anxious on this show over the last year about the possibility of overheating labor markets. And unfortunately, that's what seems to be materializing, with average real wages having one of their worst performances over the last year that we have seen.
Larry, we've got a big event coming up on the weekend. That's the first round in the presidential election over in France. We have Marine Le Pen, who was often thought to be just almost impossible to elect, although it's a closer race at the moment than we would have thought. What's going on there?
Look, I'm not a political expert on France, but what I see is eerily reminiscent of the period before Brexit in the U.S., in the UK, and the period before Donald Trump's 2016 election in the United States. I think by far the more likely thing is that President Macron will win, but we have to recognize that the fact that Marine Le Pen will ultimately be elected looks at least as plausible now as Donald Trump's election did a bit before the U.S. election, or as Brexit did a bit before the British election. So I think we need to be nervous as we watch that situation, and all people of goodwill have to be standing with the French people. But I think this shows the power of pocketbook issues for regular people and frustration with elites, which has been a potent political force all over the world. Again, I think this is going to end with President Macron, but nobody should be serene or complacent that that's the case.
And part of the reason why Ms. Le Pen is catching up to Mr. Macron actually has to do with Ukraine, because Mr. Macron has really been focused on Ukraine and international issues, while Marine Le Pen is focusing on how much people pay at the gas tank and also for their food. So let's talk about what's going on right now with Ukraine and Russia. And my question is Russia really prevailing, or at least fighting to a stalemate, the United States when it comes to the economic war as opposed to the military war, much the way Russia seems to be losing or at a stalemate in the military war?
I think we're going to need to ratchet it up if we want to do grave damage to the Russian economy. We can't allow it to continue to be the case that Russia is able to get huge levels of hard currency from the sale of products. It can't continue to be the case that there's a way that the Russian financial system can connect in a global context, but that is going to mean some sacrifice. And I think the question is whether the West is going to be prepared to make those sacrifices. I certainly hope so, and I think President Biden has shown wonderful leadership on this, but a huge amount depends on Europe right now. I hope we will be prepared to spend $1 on arming Ukraine for every $2 or $3 that we allow Russia to get in hard currency by exporting energy products to Europe. If we do that, Ukraine would be in a much stronger position to win this war and repel this barbaric invasion.
And Larry, in the meantime, the COVID pandemic is not over. Just ask the people in Shanghai. Look at what's happened in Shanghai. It's so dramatic. Who would have thought this would happen? At the same time, China seems to be backing off a little bit some of its distance from the West. For example, with respect to the audit position with publicly traded companies from China. Is President Xi feeling the pressure there?
I think there must be sweaty palms behind the facade in China right now. David, I've been saying for some time that it's a mistake to view China as a rampaging economic giant in the way that many in the United States viewed Japan at the end of the 1980s. That between exit from COVID, profound financial strains, internal issues around inequality, tension over state enterprises, China has real economic vulnerabilities. What I'm fearful of is that those vulnerabilities will translate into hostile nationalist impulses as a way of holding the country together when the glue of rapidly growing prosperity starts to peel and flake off. So I think we need to be doing a lot of hard thinking about how we're approaching China going forward.
And finally, Larry, let's finish with a couple of rapid fire questions. First, Elon Musk, very much in the news this week because he took that big stake in Twitter. What did you make of that?
Elon Musk and Twitter seem almost made for each other. It's hard to imagine a less passive shareholder. I suspect that's going to give the business press a lot of stuff to cover going forward.
And finally, Larry, I'm used to seeing your name in the front section of the New York Times, not so much the sports section. And by the way, it was tied to the Masters. I thought maybe you were competing this year.
No such luck for me. The course record is 40 strokes behind my score, but I was talking about record inflation in the Augusta pimento and cheese sandwiches, which is an illustration, alas, of how pervasive inflation now is in our economy.